Hey guys, Jordan here from BDS Suspension. Today we have a 2020 Chevy Silverado 1500 diesel. Now I'm going to be taking you kind of step by step on how to install our 4-inch BDS IFS system kit. Now the first step is we're going to disconnect the tie rod end from the knuckle. Now I have my 3/8 impact here, and we're just going to use a 21mm socket to get that nut loose here. The next trick is to get that tie rod end disconnected from the steering knuckle. So now if you see how that tie rod end is tapered, so if it was fully threaded, you wouldn't want to hit it with a hammer because you would damage those threads and wouldn't be able to get your nut back on. But luckily we have this, and you can use a traditional pickle fork, but I just like hitting it with a hammer. So just a couple whacks and it comes right up. So now our next step is to disconnect all these ABS brackets hooked to the steering knuckle. And you can see that there's one back here, one right here, and then one right here. So those are all just 10mm bolts, and just take your impact and zip those all off and get those all loose. So now our next step is to disconnect the caliper from the rotor and the steering knuckle. Now it's just two 18mm bolts back here that we're going to take loose. And you just want to make sure that you have something, either a bungee cord, but we got these nice little hooks that we made, and just hang this on so you don't stretch that line. So just you want to make sure that there's a lot of slack left when you do hang it up so it doesn't break that line. You don't want fluid leaking out everywhere when you do that. Now our next step is to get the rotor off the steering knuckle. Now this is held together with a Torx bolt here, and it's a T30 head. And I would advise against using air tools, or just use hand tools, because for this one it will strip out really easy, and it's not a need, but if you can have it, you might as well use it. So just be real careful about breaking that loose, and break it loose. And if you want to break it loose with a hand tool and then just take it out with an impact, that's fine, but just make sure that you don't strip that out, because once they get thrusty, it will be impossible to get out. Now the next step is to get the CV nut off the wheel bearing to allow to push that CV back. So now I had to switch to a 1/2 inch gun because just our 3/8 guns just don't have enough guts. So it's a 36mm socket that I use. Now next we have to disconnect the upper ball joint from the knuckle. Now this is just a nut with an 18mm socket. And what I like to do is, I don't like to thread it all the way off because then it will pop out of there. So I'll show you what to do here. Is just, you have to take a hammer and just give the knuckle a couple good whacks, and be careful from hitting the boot because you don't want to tear that boot. So just, and you see how it popped up, now it's free off of that. Now just take a pry bar and push down on that, be able to give you your freedom to get that nut off, and then let it go. And what I like to do is, you can probably just push it up and move that out of the way, and you're free. Now next step is to just disconnect the sway bar link from the arm. Now the nut is kind of hidden up in the arm, but you should be able to feel it with your fingers. And just take your 18mm socket and take her off. Now the next step is we're going to remove our sway bar from the vehicle completely. So we already disconnected the links, so those should just allow to pop right up. So we're going to disconnect these two bolts on this side and then this side. And you should use somebody to help you here because the sway bar is kind of heavy, so when you loosen this one side, you don't want it to swing out and hit you. So I'm going to go ahead and loosen my side quick. Now it should allow that sway bar to drop out of the way, and what you have to do is you have to pick up those links to get it out of the arm and just maneuver out of there and just set her on the ground behind you. Now moving forward, our next step is to loosen these control arm cam bolts on your lower arm. So now this is just a 27mm socket, and you want to loosen these. You don't want to take it all the way out because you'll see in the next steps why, but we're just going to loosen these up on each side. So next step is, the CV is still pushing this wheel bearing. So sometimes they come out on their own, but other times you gotta give them a little bit of force. And We tend to use our air hammers quite a bit for this because it's nice and easy. You don't have to put a lot of force on it. But you want to refrain from using a hammer to do this. If you have an air hammer, use the air hammer, but you can see how the hammer is bigger than what the CV nut area is. So what you're going to do, if you hit it, you're going to jam that, and just like a tie rod end, if it's fully threaded, you'll ruin those threads. You won't be able to get your nut back on, and that's a pretty expensive part. You don't want to have to replace it on a brand new truck. So then when you use your air hammer, you want to make sure you use something that's smaller than the area, how it fits right in there, and you don't want to use something like this that would just mound those threads as well. So just make sure it's a nice round one that gets in there, and they are pretty loud, so you probably should wear ear protection when you do it, and just give it a couple, and it pushes it right on back. Now our next step is to remove the 2 lower strut bolts that hold on to the lower control arm. Now remember, you already loosened your arms and all your CVs and all your other ball joints, so when you loosen the second one of these, everything's going to want to swing down out of the way. So earlier when we disconnected all the ABS sensor, just make sure that ABS sensor is out of the knuckle, because you don't want that ripping out. And then that's why we also push that back with that air hammer. So we'll be able to get it, once we loosen this, we'll be able to get that out of the way and just swing everything down without ruining these boots. So go ahead and loosen these 2 bolts. Now it probably helps to have a buddy, or maybe even do it with a stand underneath it, but sometimes I just think it's quicker to do it this way. So what I would do is maybe hold everything with your knee, get the nut on there. Now you can see how it's starting to drop already. And now just make sure you push that CV out of the way. Pull up on it so it doesn't ruin the boot. Let everything swing. And you're clear. So now our next step is to remove the 3 nuts that hold the strut to the frame. Now there's, on the passenger side, you see these 2 right here, and then there's this wire harness. So you go ahead and, you can take a pry bar or anything that you want, and just kind of pop that wire harness out of the way. You can kind of see, and then in the back, you kind of see that maybe aluminum foil style wrap, and you can push that up, and it's kind of hooked to that nut way back there on that stud, and push up, and you can see that 3rd stud there. So now on the passenger side, and I'll show you here, that you have to open up the hood and get in the engine bay to loosen that 3rd one, because it's kind of a hassle with a wrench. So we'll just go ahead and do that one first, so we can do these 2 later, so we can hold the strut so it doesn't just fall out of there. So now, you pop the hood to get that nut off that stud on that strut. So you can use a swivel, you don't have to, but I think it's just easier to use a swivel. And it's kind of a pain to get through all these wire harnesses and stuff. Just kind of guide it. Get it on that stud. So now that you got the 1 nut off the stud in the back up in the engine bay, so go ahead and get these loose. So we use a ratcheting wrench, but I don't like to break things loose with a ratcheting wrench because you break those teeth and then it doesn't want to ratchet right. So just go ahead and use your regular wrench and break those loose. Move that wire harness out of the way if you need to more. And then go ahead and just get your ratcheting wrench on. It goes a lot quicker that way. So now that we almost got this out, just make sure that you hold on to this, because you don't want this strut falling out, because you will need it if you don't have the 2.5 coilover conversion kit. Spin that off, and now you're out. Now on the driver's side, while removing the strut, you don't have to get in the engine bay to remove those nuts off those studs on that, but there still is a wire harness that's a little bit different, and you'll just see it's kind of the same thing. They're kind of just up over those studs, so just kind of push them out of the way. Sometimes they can be a bit of a pain, but you can just push that out of the way and then pull up and go ahead and break those free, just like on the other side. So the next step is to get the arm and the knuckle out of the truck. Now you can do this 1 of 2 ways. You can either just leave this all assembled right here and take these nuts the rest of the way off and just have a buddy and just help you guys take the whole thing out. But I like to do it a little bit easier. So what I would do is just loosen this lower ball joint nut, and it will be a 24mm socket. When you go ahead and loosen that, sometimes it just likes to pop out of there on its own, but more times than not, it won't. So just take your big hammer and the same as the tie rod end. Luckily it has a tapered end, so you can hit it with the hammer and it won't mess up the threads. And it also has a little concave hole in the center of it. So if you wanted to be able to put a punch in there and you were too worried about damaging threads, you can put a punch in that and just hit it out. But with ours being fairly new, so you didn't even have to hit it, and it came right out. So that's the easiest method to do that. And then that was also why I had you guys leave those nuts on, because if you do hit it, you don't want these bolts falling out, and then while you're hitting this, all of a sudden the whole thing comes out, and so you don't need that happening. So go ahead and take your 27mm socket, get these nuts off the cam bolts the rest of the way. Make sure it doesn't spin too crazy on you. Take her out of there. So now once you get those cam bolts out of there and that arm dropped out of there, you'll see that the cam plates, since GM has this goo instead of actual paint, they like to stick to there, and you'll need to remove that. You won't need these later, but obviously you just want to remove that because you don't need stuff falling off while you're driving down the road. Now our next step is to remove the rear cross member from the vehicle. Now as you can see, there's 2 bolts right here, 2 bolts over here, and then the bolt and nut that run through the front differential that hook onto the cross member as well. So we're going to start first by taking all these and loosening all these bolts and nuts right here. So after you loosen these nuts, just keep these bolts in here, so when you do take this bolt and nut out, the whole thing won't just fall on you. So go ahead and that front diff will drop a little bit, but not enough to move or scare you, because you should have your other bolts already still hooked up. And just be careful of your drive shaft not hitting anything when you do that. So go ahead and pull these out of here. And there she goes. So now next step to help you is these transmission lines. So when we drop this drive shaft out of the way to be able to get this diff out, it's going to be sitting on these transmission lines, and we don't want that to happen. And eventually we're going to have a bracket that holds these down, because we're going to drop everything down. But we'll get to that when that comes. But for now, we're just going to remove this bolt right here and then this nut on this stud up here on that holds these transmission lines on. And they're just a couple little simple brackets. So we'll just go ahead and get those loose, take those off. And I went with, and it's a 13mm, and I went with a ratcheting wrench. This one's gonna be a little bit more difficult, and you can see it way up there by this black plastic piece right there. So you can just go ahead and same size. Now that we have the transmission line brackets removed from the transmission itself, it allows that more slack. And this is a diesel model thing only. You won't have to worry about this if you just have a 1500 gasser. But obviously, like I said, you can see how much more slack you get. So now that we have that, we're gonna go ahead and remove these 6 bolts that hold the drive shaft on to the front differential. And you can probably do it with a ratchet wrench, but it'd be easier just to take your impact and your 10mm socket and an extension and just put it up over those transmission lines, put it on there, and be careful because these all are small bolts and you don't want to strip those out. And just loosen them all, and you just go ahead and rotate that, get it where you need. That sometimes you'll have to hit that with a hammer, just give it a nice little whack to be able to break those loose. But in this case, you don't need to. And some of them might be just threaded on there a little bit more, holding it on. And now you can see how that's out of there. Now, go ahead and remove the bolts and these little U-plate guards, I guess you could call it, from the drive shaft itself. You might have to thread it on because they do put a lot of Loctite on these, which they should. Now what I like to do is, you can see how these are kind of just resting on these lines. I like to take a bungee cord, and I'll grab one here in a second, and just wrap around and just kind of prop that up. So it's just holding up by the bungee cord, not just laying on these lines or hurting those boots back there, so you don't have to replace stuff if you don't need to. Now our next step is to remove this plastic little splash guard slash skid plate, and we already had to remove this aluminum one down here. We had to remove that before we put the truck in there to get a couple measurements. So those just have 4 13mm bolts, and 2 of them actually slide underneath this plastic guard here, and it holds them both on. So there's only 2 left on this guard. And these are also just 13mm bolts. And they shouldn't be that tight, so they come right off. And you can see that I didn't see, but there's just these little plastic clips that just clip that on. And they're pretty simple. They're just like basically like a U. They just clamp over, you just gotta pull it off. And there's that one. Now, before you get the differential out, it'd be easier if you took CVs out on both sides. So there's a couple ways you can do that. One, you can either take a hammer, and I would take like a dead blow hammer or something like this where it's not metal, it's not gonna damage that boot or that inner metal part. Or you take a pry bar and just stick it between where that boot is and everything and push out. And just go ahead and pull that out, and you can see, and you just want to make sure that you don't drop this because you don't need to ruin those splines or anything. So just put it in a safe place where it won't get damaged. Our next step before you get the differential out also is to disconnect this wiring clip. So now all these are kind of different on these trucks, but these should be the same for the same model and year and everything. But there's a little red plastic piece right there. Go ahead and just take a screwdriver and just pop that out, and you'll kind of hear it just click out. So now that you got that red clip pushed back, you gotta be very careful while using these because they don't give you enough room really. I mean, you can push it back to get it, but you gotta have a lot of finger strength and grip to pull that out of there. So I just like to kind of clamp that and just push that little pin down, and allows you to slide those right out of there. And now it is connected with a Christmas tree clip on the differential. So you'll have to take a clip tool, go ahead and pop her in there and just pull it out of there. And there's also one on the very, very top of the differential, and they just kind of go in a couple different holes on that faceplate there. So now before removing your bolts to get your front diff out, there is a breather tube on the very top of the differential, and you just kind of feel around, and it's pretty small. So just go ahead and yank on it and pull it out of there, and you can kind of see it right here. Just kind of a rubber hose, and just push it back up there, and it's out of your way for now. So now to get the differential out, there's just 2 bolts remaining since you already got the crossmember bolt out. There's this one right here, and there's one on the other side. Now, we recommend that you use a trans jack if you don't have anybody to help you, but since I have a buddy here, I'm gonna go ahead and get these loose. So now, when you get this bolt off, it's just a 21mm wrench on this side, and then I would use a 3-inch extension, a swivel, and just a 21mm socket, and just put it up in there. So make sure that you keep that bolt in there, so just keep pressure on this side so it doesn't come out all the way. And then you can have your buddy on this side, hold that, and then we'll come over here on this side, and he's got this Torx bolt here. And all it is just a T55, and since we don't have a 3/8 version of this, I'm just gonna use our 1/2-inch gun. Just be careful because it is a Torx, and you will strip it out very easily, and you do need to reuse this, so go ahead and just do that, and just kind of get it loose, and have your buddy take his bolt out, and then go ahead and take your bolt out. And these are pretty light, and then you'll just have to kind of maneuver these out of here. Go ahead and set it on the way, and you got your differential out. So we got our differential out, and my buddy had an easy time doing it, but you can see that right here, this is where your differential sits right here, and then this bolt sits right here. So sometimes, since this bolt is so long and there's not much room, you sometimes can have problems trying to get this bolt out of here, but he did it pretty easily, so just be aware that sometimes this always doesn't just come out super simple. So now that you got the diff out and all the cross members and all your front suspension, now it's time to cut to make some clearance for some brackets. So now first what we got to do is, since we have this goo on here, just go ahead and clean all of it off because it is flammable. So when sparks do fly, you don't need, it catching on fire on you. So go ahead and just clean it off with a putty knife, and I do like to keep it on the rag and throw it away because it does get very sticky and it does not like to come clean. And just go ahead and take some brake cleaner, some cleaner, just spray it on there. It doesn't have to be totally clean. It just needs to be clean enough so when you do cut and make your cut lines, you want to be able to see them and not have to try to figure out where it is through the goo. So just clean it up the best you can and do it on each side, this side and this side, and also on the rear side as well. So now that you got your front differential out, it's time to make a couple cuts. And I want to first start off by saying, if you're not comfortable doing these measurements or these cuts, I would get a trained professional. And there's a couple different tools you can use, such as a cutoff wheel or plasma cutter or a Sawzall. But like I said, if you're not comfortable with any of those, find somebody who is and let them make the cuts for you. Now the first cut that you have to make is on the driver's side rear control arm pocket where that cross member was that you took out. Now the first measurement is all pretty straightforward. Just put your tape measure here and measure 2 9/16 and just make a line up. And then do the same exact thing on the back side and just make a measurement from 2 9/16 and just connect those two lines and you'll just make one big cut across and cut it pretty straight. And then on the passenger side, on the rear control arm pocket, you've got to find your differential drop bracket and just, you'll see this little pin here and little pinhole. You just kind of line it up and then line up this hole with this hole right here. And all you got to do is just take your paint marker and just measure that all the way down and kind of just make right in the middle of these two holes and just measure that all the way and just draw that out and just cut that off. Now that we're getting ready to cut, you just want to make sure that you have your lines pretty well marked out, and I kind of don't here, but just make sure that it's the right measurements. Our instructions tell you what measurements, so just make sure that when you did sketch that line that is roughly to that measurement. And I like to use on this side a air cutoff wheel, because now when you're doing this cut, I like to use my air cutoff wheel here instead of a big angle grinder or a Sawzall, because since a little cut, you can kind of maneuver this more than you would be able to maybe a corded angle grinder or a Sawzall. So I like to use these, and it's smaller, so you can kind of move it where you want to move it, and it's a lot easier to use it this way. So we're going to go ahead and make this cut, and always wear eye protection when you are cutting stuff. And then what I like to do once you get to the edge there, just take a hammer, just be careful because it will be sharp and hot. Kind of just hit it off of there, and there's your cut. So now on the driver's side rear control arm pocket, the measurement of 2 9/16 that we're going to cut, I'm going to go ahead and use my Sawzall on this because it's just one straight cut straight down, and I think that this works really well for this, and it's the cleanest way that you can use this. So what you should do is start off on this and cut a little bit, and then go to your back side and then cut the rest of it and kind of just meet those two cuts and just cut it straight down. And it's not that critical that you make it straight, but just the straighter it is, the prettier it looks. And so we're gonna go ahead and start cutting this off. Now just be careful that you don't hit any rubber lines or anything like that. So just make sure you have a good length Sawzall. Now our next cuts that we need to make are on our front lower control arm pockets. Now basically all you need to do is see kind of where it curves up there. Just kind of meet right in that middle where that curve starts and kind of just take it all the way across here. And you're kind of just gonna make kind of like an arc here and just arc it down. And that just provides clearance for your front cross member that you're gonna install. And then just the same exact thing on this side. Just go ahead and where it kind of starts to bend up, just kind of make a straight line and just kind of arc it down. And we'll go ahead and use our air cutoff wheel for that one. So then it's a smaller cut. Now your final cut before you start putting everything back together will be this driver side rear control arm pocket. You already made your vertical cut. Now you need to make this horizontal cut. So now your measurement, all you gotta do is take your tape measure and hook it on that control arm bolt hole and measure down 1 3/8 and just make it straight across and just cut that notch off. And that'll help you be able to fit your rear cross member in when it's time to put that in. Now that you have all your cuts made, it's a good idea to take an angle grinder and clean up any sharp edges and get things ready, because in a couple steps from here, we're gonna actually start a little bit of welding. So just make sure everything's pretty straight and nice and square, and make sure, what I like to do is take my cross members and just make sure everything fits, because that's why we did all that cutting, was to make sure everything fits there. So just go ahead and take your angle grinder or whatever kind of grinder you got and just smooth everything out, make sure everything's nice and square. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. So now that you have all your grinding done, we're gonna prep this driver's side rear control arm pocket for welding. Now all we really need to do is just clean off all this goo and excess paint and make it just a nice finish so you can have a nice weld. So all it's gonna be is just this square plate, and we're just gonna make sure everything's nice and square. You don't wanna have it be able to rock because you don't wanna have a hard place to weld. It's just gonna be flush with this front area that we already cut off. And so just go ahead and take your cleaner and just make it as clean as you can get it. And like I said, it can be a pain because this goo stuff. So now that you got all your prep work done for the weld, you're gonna go ahead and take your plate and you're gonna put it on this lower driver side control arm pocket. And like I said, you wanna make sure that it's flush or just slightly above this cut on the front side of that pocket, because if it's not, your crossmember will hit it and you don't want to have to grind this off once you get this welded in place. And it's very important while welding to have your battery disconnected on your vehicle and also a good ground. So I just like to go over here where I already had all the goo off and just kind of clean it all up and get your nice ground. So go ahead and make sure you have a trained professional as well to do this welding, because you don't want to mess this up or not have a good weld and have this break off later. So what I like to do is just tack it on each side. And then we'll start burning it all the way down. And you're gonna wanna go up on the top and then all the way along the bottom on each side. So go ahead and just weld that in place. For the most part, we got it pretty well good. So you wanna make sure that you do it on this top side and not on the back side here, because you don't want your crossmember running into that. So go ahead and just do it on the top, on the inside edge of this. So now that you have all your grinding, welding, and cutting done, you're gonna go ahead and just take some black generic spray paint, and wherever there's just bare metal that you had to grind off or clean off, just go ahead and spray it up real quick, because you don't want that to rust. Maybe give it a couple coats, and then you come over to your welding plate. Paint that right up. Now that we have everything welded and painted, we're gonna go ahead and start our reassembly of the truck. So first we're gonna use our differential drop brackets, and this is the driver's side that we're gonna use, and it just basically looks like a little L. And you'll kind of see the little pinhole there, and there's a pin on the front part of the driver's side control arm pocket. So you're gonna go ahead and slide this part up between those two, put that hole in that pin, and just take this long Torx bolt that you took off originally, the factory one, and just try to find home and slide it through. So now that you have that driver's side differential drop bracket in, you're gonna go ahead and install your front cross member. Now you can kind of see, if we turn it to the side here, how it sticks out this way. So this is gonna be your front face. So just make sure you install it right. And then we do provide new bolts for this, and they are in a bolt pack, and there's only 4 of them in a bolt pack, and they are the shorter ones. So go ahead and slide those up there. Run your bolts through. Now on this back side, you just wanna make sure that you run that bolt through that bracket that you just put in. Just go ahead and put your nut and washer on and leave this loose so you can maneuver stuff later. Now that we have the front crossmember installed, we're gonna go ahead and install the rest of our differential drop brackets. Now on the passenger side, you're gonna have this U-shaped one, and these 2 holes are actually gonna face the rear. And in your bolt pack, you're gonna have a 14mm bolt instead of that long bolt that you had earlier, but you will use your factory nut, kind of just looks like that. So go ahead and put this on the front side of that original mount and just kind of snug that up, but don't tighten it. Now that you got the drop bracket installed on the passenger side, we're gonna go ahead and install this brace. Now, just like the driver's side, there is an alignment pin for this, so you're gonna go ahead and throw this up behind that, install that on that alignment pin, and you will have a provided 9/16 bolt, and you're gonna put it on the side closest to the passenger side, not the inside of it. Just go ahead and take your washer and your nut and install that. Now that you have that brace hooked up on the top part, you're gonna go ahead and install the provided sleeve on this outer bolt hole, and take your bolt and just stick it through that hole on the back side, and you'll see it just poking through there. And then once you tighten that, that'll help just keep that not too tight, and it will keep that spaced out. Now that you have all your differential drop brackets installed, we're gonna go ahead and put the diff back in. So we provide you a couple 9/16 bolts, and we're gonna grab a buddy and we're gonna pick up the diff. It's gonna be easier to do the passenger side. So the passenger side, the front of it gets this little key spacer. So you're gonna go ahead and just try and throw that in there. And then just make sure it goes through your other bracket as well on the back side. And then go ahead and help your buddy put his side up. And he just runs that through that bracket, dropping down there and through that way. Now that you have your differential installed, you're gonna go ahead and put your rear cross member in. Now you can see that we have these tabs that allow for this other bushing on the back side of that diff to sit in, but we're not gonna worry about that right now. We're just gonna install these in the old control arm pockets. Run your bolts from front to rear. And there you go. With the rear cross member in, now you're gonna go ahead and push up on your differential and just put your new 9/16 bolt through the cross member and hold that in. And you should leave everything loose, so that allows you to be able to move that as you wish. So it moves pretty easily to be able to push up on it, so you shouldn't need anybody else. Just go ahead and put that in there and leave that stuff loose for now. Now that everything is in right here, you're gonna go ahead and take your wire harness that you unplugged earlier, and you're gonna just plug that back into the differential, and you're gonna hit click, and then that little red tab that we pried out when we got it off, just go ahead and push that in, and that should lock it in place. And then if you can, just use one of the factory Christmas tree clips and kind of just hook it onto place so it doesn't go falling off on you. So now we have to install our sway bar drop brackets. So all these are, as you can see, just like most of our stuff, we have a little pin here. And on the back side of this cross member, you just take your nut and your washer off. And you put the bigger hole, obviously, where the bolt is, and then just try to make sure that pin goes in there. And just put your nut and washer back on. And these really can only be installed one way, so there is a driver and a passenger side, but they're not that difficult. And then we do provide you with some new hardware to put in the frame to hold this part up. And it's sometimes just gotta line it up the right way, and it gotta be almost perfect. Now locate your breather tube that you pulled off earlier, and you might have to give it some slack and pull on it a little bit or disconnect some clips, but in this instance we are fine. So just find that little hole that you pulled it off of earlier and just push it back down on that, and it should not go anywhere. Now that you have your sway bar drop brackets in, we're gonna go ahead and install the lower control arms. Now, we have our new cams here, so you don't have to use those factory cam bolts. And you can see that we give a pretty tight tolerance here. So if you have a vise or just a table or anything, go ahead and throw those in a vise and just whack down. And it kind of just lets those go on. And they aren't that tight that you have to whack a bunch, but just more that you have to give it with your own arm strength. So there should be only 4 of these. So go ahead and just put all these in there. Now that you have your cam washers on your cam bolts, we're gonna go ahead and grab the lower control arm. We're gonna go ahead and throw these in the 2 pockets of the cross member that you installed. Now the rear bolt is gonna have to run from rear to front. And it is nice to have a friend help you with this, but you can do it on your own. And then the front one is just front to rear. So they both are facing the same way. You just wanna make sure that those cam washers are in these slots on the cross member. So now that you have your arm in and your cam bolts, you're going to go ahead and take your other 4 cam washers and put them on the back side. And these can only go on one way, so whatever way the back way or the front way faces, they will face the same way. And when you do install these and eventually tighten it, you do want these most of the cam facing upward. Now moving forward, our next step is to just go ahead and tighten all your differential hardware and your crossmember hardware, but do not tighten your lower cam bolts just yet. So go ahead and just tighten everything up. Now that you have all your differential and crossmember bolts tightened, you're going to go ahead and throw that drive shaft back in. And we're just going to use the original hardware that we took out of that. But you have to make sure that you use thread locker because you don't want those coming out on you when you're going down the road. So just go ahead and line up all your holes. And you gotta hurry because Loctite does dry in a decent amount of time. So you don't have that long to install it. And I kind of like to go in a bit of a star pattern when you do this, just so it all comes out even. And you're not tightening one side more than the other side. And then once you go back and hit them, I would go back and just give them all a couple good turns real quick. And like I said, do be careful when you do this because you can't strip these very easily, as it wants to on me. And there's your drive shaft. Now that we have all that installed and tightened up, we're gonna go ahead and throw our strut spacer on top of our strut. Now these only go on one way, so they're pretty hard to mess up. So just go ahead and throw that on there. And in this box kit, we do provide new nuts and bolts to attach to these studs here. So just go ahead and throw all those on and then just tighten those up for driver and passenger side. Now that you have those strut spacers assembled on the strut, we're gonna go ahead and throw this in the vehicle. So now with these top studs, you just gotta use the factory nuts that came on the original studs. And you wanna make sure that this is all oriented properly. So now our next step is to swap over everything from this factory aluminum knuckle to our big giant BDS cast steering knuckle. So we're gonna go ahead and loosen all these, take these 4 bolts out here that hold the wheel bearing on the knuckle. Sometimes, even though they're pretty new, these wheel bearings are pretty tight in there. So just give it a few whacks. And it will just come right out of there. Now, there are 2 O-rings on these. One you can see here is in the inside of that one. So just go ahead and take a pick or a screwdriver and pick that out of there. And it will just go right back into this one. And then this one just sits right here. So when you do take this all off, it'll just sit right there on that. And I'll show you here in a little bit when we have to do that. Now that we have that stock steering knuckle all tore back apart, we're gonna go ahead and trim this brake dust shield. Now this just provides some extra clearance for when you put your caliper and your rotor back on. So you can see I just marked out where I needed to trim it at. And once again, I just like to use the smaller stuff, cutting smaller stuff. And it will be kind of loud here. Now that you have that all trimmed up, just like on the frame, we're gonna go ahead and clean up any sharp edges and just kind of make it nice and clean. And be careful though, because with these grinders, you can take a lot off in a little amount of time. So just go ahead and do it pretty lightly. Now that you have your dust shield trimmed, we're gonna go ahead and swap over our new knuckle onto the wheel bearing and the dust cover. So we're gonna go ahead and take our 1 O-ring and just throw it right here. Just up over that and make sure it just sits nice and flush with that. And then take your other one and go ahead and take it in this knuckle and kind of just work it around. And sometimes they can not be fun to do, but sometimes they go in really, really easy. And you want to make sure that it is in there nice and flush, like how that one is all the way around. So then you want to take your knuckle and you want to go ahead and set it on right on top of this. Just make sure it's a nice and solid fit. And then take your bolts. So you do want to Loctite these bolts, every single one of them, and get each of them started. before you go tightening. And just kind of like I always do, just a crisscross pattern. Just make sure it's all nice and flush on there, and you should be ready to rock. Now that you have that knuckle all situated, we're gonna go ahead and install our CV shafts again. So all you gotta do is just kind of line the splines up and go ahead and just kind of slide it in there. And then we do provide you with a new CV spacer, and you're gonna wanna put that on to where that chamfered edge faces the inside towards of the vehicle, and go ahead and just sit it right on there. And you can kind of feel it sits right nice with that machined of that CV shaft. So go ahead and just toss that on there. Now that you got the CV shaft installed, we're gonna go ahead and throw the knuckle onto the lower arm. And you can probably use a buddy to have you help you do this. So I have my buddy here, and just gonna go ahead and pick up the knuckle and kind of just set it into that lower ball joint mount area. And kind of just let it swing there for the time being. Now that you have that knuckle installed into that lower ball joint, we're gonna go ahead and just take our 24mm socket and just tighten these up real quick. Just do each side quick. Just makes it a little bit safer when you're getting ready to do your next steps here. Now your next step is to swing that lower arm and that knuckle up and install the knuckle into the upper ball joint, and then also put the CV shaft and the spacer into that wheel bearing. So you're gonna go ahead and just grab this and swing up, and just be careful that you don't want to hit these threads on anything, and make sure that spacer's still on there, and just swing it up. And you might have to fight the threads a little bit, or the splines a little bit on that CV. So go ahead and pull up, grab your upper ball joint nut, give her a couple turns, and she should be good there. So now that you have that all assembled on the upper ball joint and the knuckle, we're gonna go ahead and grab a stand. And these are really nice for when you are working on a hoist, because you just wanna bring that lower arm up to that strut. And you can kind of see these two little, I guess, nut tabs on here, and just bring it up as much as you want to where you should be good enough to be able to thread your bolts in. So just go ahead and grab your factory bolts and just go through your lower arm like you would normally, and just thread them in a couple turns and just tighten them up. Now that you have the lower portion of your strut tightened to the lower arm, we're gonna go ahead and tighten our upper ball joint and the top of our strut to the frame. So go ahead and just take your wrench, just make sure it's nice and snug, and go ahead and do the same thing on the top here. And remember, on this side, when we took it off, we had to access it through the engine bay. So just use your ratchet wrench to tighten these two first, and then get it on the top and use your impact. So now your next step is to go ahead and thread your CV axle nut on. And when I tighten those, I like to pretty much go as much as I can with that gun, so that it doesn't any kind of pulling it out or any chance of it coming loose. So just go ahead and just give your all with your biggest gun that you got. Now that they have that CV axle nut tightened, we're gonna go ahead and throw our brake rotor back on. And you just wanna make sure that it's oriented the right way, so when you do put that little Torx set screw in there, it can go right in that threaded part. So go ahead and throw that guy on. And you don't need to Loctite this or anything, because it probably will never come off, and if you do need it off, it will probably be rusted on. So just don't tighten it too much. And then go ahead and take your caliper bolts, go ahead and Loctite those, and get your caliper off your hook and slide that on. Just make sure everything's nice and lined up. And that's the one good thing about those little set screws, is that it holds that rotor on for you, so you're not sitting there fighting trying to push the rotor back on. Now that everything's back assembled brake wise, you're going to go ahead and we give you a replacement tie rod end. So we're going to go ahead and just throw that in that knuckle to have it be held, and just grab your 24mm wrench and just break that jam nut loose. Go ahead and twist this off. Then go ahead and grab your new tie rod end. Just go ahead and thread that on there. And we're gonna leave about 5/8 threads showing left from this part where it stops to that jam nut. So go ahead and just spin that on, and you can measure whenever you want. Just need to be somewhat close. It just helps a lot better for alignment and adjusting your toe. So go ahead and throw that tie rod back in there. Grab your nut, twist that on, and then you cannot forget this. There is a grease zerk that we provide separate, and you just thread that on there and just make sure that it's nice and tight. And then when you do tighten that, go ahead and grease that a couple times just to kind of fill it up with grease and make it nice and movable so you don't ruin that tie rod end. Now we're almost getting to the stopping point of the front of the vehicle to be completely done with it. So now our next step is to go ahead and run these ABS wire. So you're gonna go ahead and just take all these factory clips off, and they're just nice little U clips, so you just pull them right off. And then on this top here, we provide you with this new ABS bracket. So you're just gonna take your factory bolt, and you can see this little tab. There's just a little nice alignment tab. Just set it in there and thread that bolt in. And you're gonna go ahead and just take your wire here and just slide that in there, and it kind of holds that in place. And then you're gonna take these on the back side and just set them kind of wherever they want to fit to give you enough slack, and just hook them around. And then there's holes on the entire back side, and you can see them right here as well, for these ABS brackets, for these little line clamps. So go ahead and just take as many as you need, and we also provide you with zip ties. So if you feel like you need to zip tie some stuff so nothing gets pinched or rubbed by a tire or whatever, by all means do that. But for now, I'm just gonna go ahead and use these wire clamps. We're just gonna bolt them to it. And now I almost forgot that you have to cut this brake line bracket on 2020 and plus years models. So we basically just don't have enough slack here, and we didn't want to take this factory brake line bracket away. So all you're gonna do is just take your cutoff wheel and make a nice straight line and just kind of go really slow at it, and eventually get it to where you're able to just break it off, because you do not want to hit this line, because you don't want to have to replace a brand new brake line. So just go ahead and take your grinder. Just go ahead and be real careful, and you probably will break it off. Just make sure that you don't hit that line, and if it is damaged, you might want to replace it. Just depends on how badly damaged it is, but I would advise just replacing it since you're already here. Now that you have that brake line bracket cut off, we're gonna go ahead and take our big wire clamp that we provide you and just hook it over that, and you're just gonna go push your thumb and clamp that, and take your factory bolt and just thread that guy in there, and kind of just keeps that in place just like that old bracket did, and just tighten that bolt up. Now, one of your last final steps on the front is to go ahead and tighten those cam nuts up. So you don't want to tighten them too much, because you want to be able to settle your suspension when you do sit on the ground. So those will be tightened all the way on the ground. So just go ahead and snug them up. And remember that you want the cam part up. So you want where the most amount of it is. So you basically put your nut on the bottom and your bolt head on the bottom. So just like I said, snug it up. You can use a wrench on one side to kind of guide it where you want it to go, turn it where you need it to go. And just make sure that your cams are in the little slots on each side there. So then just go to your other side. Make sure everything's in. Just make sure they're, and the reason we put these cams up like this is just so it's easier for alignment later. Now your final step before you move to the back is we're gonna reinstall our sway bar and our sway bar links. So it's easiest if you grab a friend. So the best way to do this would be to take your links and fold them down and put them in those holes on the lower arms, and just push this up. Take your bolt, and we provide new bolts for you here, and nuts and washers. And go ahead and just tighten that up. Good. With the sway bar partly installed, we're going to go ahead and tighten up these 3/8 bolts all the way around. And then you can go ahead and just grab these and just push down on them. Now your final step before moving to the rear is you're going to go ahead and put your sway bar link nuts on, and you're basically just going to pull this down and make sure on each side that it does go in the hole, and then just thread that on a little bit. Do the same over here. And just take your socket and tighten them up. And now your front is done and you can move to the rear. Now that you're done with your front of your truck, you can go ahead and move to the rear of it. Now the first thing that we have to do is disconnect a couple ABS wire and brake line brackets just to be able to give us enough slack. So you're going to go ahead and take your 10mm socket and loosen these 2 bolts right here that hold this kind of V clip on. Kind of just pull that off of there. You see how you got some slack there. And then you go to the driver's side and you take a 13mm socket, and you can kind of see through there that there's this brake line bracket right here. There's just 2 bolts holding that on. Go ahead and break those loose. And that should give you enough slack to be able to change your shocks and put your blocks in. So that should be your first step while messing with the rear. Now that you have those ABS and brake line brackets disconnected, you're going to go ahead and put a jack stand or a screw jack, whatever you have, underneath the axle of your truck. And you're going to go ahead and loosen your shock bolts. And it's just a 21mm socket and wrench. And then you can kind of adjust your screw jack as needed to be able to pull that bolt out nice and easy. And then you're going to go ahead and use just your socket on the top, and it is kind of a pain to get through here, so you might have to turn your gun at an angle here and get it on there. Go ahead and loosen it, and that should just have a factory Welding nut on there, so you shouldn't have to get your wrench up there. And just go ahead and get your bolt loose the rest of the way. Pull it out, just go ahead and wiggle your shock out. Now that you have your shock out, you're going to go ahead and take all 4 of your U-bolt nuts out. And you won't need these U-bolts or these nuts again. So you can go ahead and just do whatever you want with them. And then what I like to do is I like to go to the passenger side and just loosen, do not remove them, just loosen all 4 of these nuts. That gives you a little bit more room to play with the axle when you put your new block in. Now that you have your U-bolt nuts removed, you're gonna go ahead and take your screw jack and just lower your axle. And you kind of see how the axle is just getting a gap between the leaf spring. So just lower that as much as you need. Watch and be careful, and you should have enough slack everywhere, but just be careful that you're not pulling any brake lines too hard or any breather lines too hard, because you don't want to rip those. And you can just remove your U-bolts, and you might just have to go up with your hoist or your jack, since I don't have enough room left. So I'm just going to go ahead and go up. So now you can see that you have your adequate space to be able to put your new block. Now for these particular blocks, they are tapered, and so our blocks always go tapered forward. So you're going to go ahead and put your pin here in this factory pin hole on the axle, slide that in, and then see how I said you can go ahead and move that axle as you wish since you loosen that side. Kind of just line that hole up there. And if it's not perfectly square, it's okay. You can kind of tilt the block as you need, and it will all, once you go up and put pressure on it, it'll just go straight where it needs to go. And then it might not want to sit in there perfectly, but once you get your U-bolts and you tighten those U-bolts up, it's going to suck that right up and you'll be fine there. So now that you got some pressure on that block, you're going to go ahead and take your new provided U-bolts, and we're going to go ahead and just throw these on there, and you can kind of see the cutout where it was, and you just remember where your factory ones came from. And the reason we give you new U-bolts is because obviously we're giving you a bigger block, and the factory U-bolts are just too short. So we're going to go ahead and put those on there, and then take your factory U-bolt plate, and then we also provide you with new nuts and washers. Put these on here, and just slide that right up. Now that you have all your nuts on your U-bolts, you're gonna go ahead and tighten them up, and you don't wanna do it too tight because you're just gonna have to tighten them on the ground, and you don't wanna do them too tight for when you do your other side, you can still move that axle. So when you tighten these, just like everything else I do, I like to do a star, but also, you also wanna make sure that you have an equal amount of threads on every single U-bolt when you're tightening. So see how this one has a little bit more than this one, which is not a huge deal there, but you don't want it to have barely any threads, and then these ones have all the threads engaged. So you just want to go ahead and tighten those up, just nice and snug. So you can kind of see how it pulled that pin down into that block, and see how it just rotates that axle forward. So go ahead and just get them all nice and snugged up. And so that should be good enough for now. And then, like I said, once you set it on the ground, you'll tighten them all the way. Now your next step to getting that one side finish is you're gonna go ahead and grab your shock. So here we have the Fox 2.0s, and we're gonna go ahead and take a little bit of just silicone spray and just spray it in. And then I like to spray each one of my sleeves and bushings. And it's nice about this truck in particular is that each bolt is the same on the top and bottom, so it doesn't matter which bushing and sleeve you press in where, you don't really have to worry about it. So we have an arbor press here, and if you have a vise, you can probably use a vise or just a hammer. So go ahead and take your bushing in your shock and put it in your arbor press and press down, and just make sure that it's nice and square. And see how it's not square? So what I do is I just give it a little tap over, and then it's nice and square on there. And then just take your sleeve, put it on here, and push her in. And then this really shouldn't matter because this should be in there pretty square regardless as when you push it in. And then just do the same for your bottom. And just make sure it's nice and square. And you're good to go with that shock. So our next step, now that you have your bushings and sleeves installed, we're gonna go ahead and install the shock on the truck. So you can see that we have stickers on each side of the shock. And the way I like to run them is so that the Fox is facing up, but you can run it however you want to. That's just how we do it here. So go ahead and take your shock and put it up in that factory bracket. Remember here, you just have a weld-on nut. Just go ahead and thread that in. And then what I like to do is leave this little strap hooked up, so then you can cut it and maybe time it right, but I didn't time it right, but shut just a little bit and get her in there. And then just make sure you take this off. Now that you have your shock and your block and your U-bolts installed, we're gonna go ahead and take out our bump stop here. Now we provide you with a bump stop extension, so you're gonna go ahead and take your 10mm socket, and all this is just a bolt up into this bump stop. You can see it's just a factory Welding nut there. And you're gonna take your newly bump stop extension, just set it on top of there, and then we provide you with these new bolts here. So you're gonna go ahead and just take this bolt and shove it in to the hole, and you can see how it sticks through there. And then what I like to do is I like to Loctite it. Go ahead and just thread around there a little bit. And just like I said, you do want to hurry quickly because Loctite does dry in a fairly quick amount of time. And just make sure that you don't strip that, because that is just a regular Allen socket head bolt. Just give it a nice couple tugs, and you got Loctite on there, remember, so you don't need to tighten it too much. But now this side is done. Now your final two steps to finishing out the lift on your truck and the rear, you're gonna go ahead and take the newly provided brake line bracket, and you're gonna install this right on the frame, and you're gonna use the two factory bolts. Now there is a nice little cutout on this bracket, so that just faces upward. Just go ahead and tighten those up by hand real quick. And then just gonna go ahead and take this part right here, the factory bracket itself, and take your new provided bolts and just drop it down and just shove those bolts through those holes. And then you're just gonna go ahead and put your nuts and washer on it and just tighten up that top and the bottom there. Now your final step is you're gonna go ahead and take this little L bracket here, and you remember earlier how on the axle we removed these 2 bolts off of this? So this has a little cutout here, and you can see kind of on here how this has that little tab. So you're gonna go ahead and take your 2 factory bolts and put them in these 2 holes right here. You're gonna find the 2 little nuts for them. And just thread those in quick. Take your impact and tighten them up. Now remember how I said that I had that little tab, so you're just going to take that tab and slide it in that slot, and you're going to be able to move it wherever you need to, but just move it to where you have those 2 holes on the factory bracket and the new provided bracket, and just slide them through and take your nuts and washers, put them on there and tighten them up, and you are good to go. Now that's how you install a 4-inch BDS lift system on a 2020 1500 diesel. Now I appreciate you guys watching this video, and if you have any questions at all, go ahead and visit bdssuspension.com or call our tech department and they can answer any questions you have about your BDS lift.